A boy stands on the edge of the Clarence River and watches the water muscle past the banks like a living thing. The world tells him he is from nowhere. Grafton, a timber town on Australia's far fringe, too far from Sydney to matter, too far from Melbourne to be feared. But in his head, the map is already changing. He isn't dreaming of escape. He's dreaming of rewiring the country, of dragging power, money, and medicine out of the capitals and forcing them to flow inland like this river. And here's the contrast that should not be possible. The man who will one day hold the nation's highest office, Prime Minister of Australia, Sovereign, will do it for just 19 days. Not a term, not an era, a blink. A political heartbeat. Yet the ideas he plants will outlive louder men with longer reigns. Earle Christmas Grafton Page is born on 8th August 1880 into a family that knows both discipline and distance. His father, Charles Page, is a schoolmaster, one of those hard-edged builders of minds who believes education is not a privilege, but a weapon. His mother, Mary, keeps the household steady in a place where the river can give and take without warning. In Grafton, life is practical. Timber, shipping, heat, mosquitoes, and the constant sense that the real decisions are made somewhere else. The young Earl grows up with that irritation in his blood. It's not resentment for its own sake. It's a question that won't leave him alone. Why should geography decide a person's chances? He is bright, restless, and, crucially, competitive with himself. At school, he learns quickly, but he also learns something more dangerous. That talent in the bush is often wasted simply because the ladder is too far away. The first tension in his life is not a villain with a face. It's the tyranny of distance. The second is time, because in the late 19th century, medicine is still a gamble, and rural Australia is where the odds are worst. People die of infections that would be survivable in a city hospital. Women give birth without trained help. Accidents on farms and in mills turn fatal because the doctor arrives too late. Page watches this and stores it away like a debt the nation owes. When he leaves for the University of Sydney to study medicine, he is stepping into a different Australia, one with sandstone buildings, a professional networks, and the quiet confidence of people who assume the country belongs to them. He doesn't fit neatly. He is not poor in the romantic sense, but he is provincial in the way the city uses the word as a weapon. He studies hard, not just to pass, but to prove that the river town can produce a mind as sharp as any in the capital. He qualifies as a doctor in 1901 at the dawn of a new nation. Federation has just stitched the colonies into the Commonwealth of Australia. The country is young, proud, and already arguing about who gets what. Page returns north. That choice matters. Many ambitious graduates stay in the city where the prestige is. Page goes back to the Clarence, back to the heat and the long roads because he wants to fix the problem where it hurts. He sets up as a surgeon in Grafton and throws himself into work with the intensity of someone racing an invisible clock. Surgery, then, is not the clean, controlled theater people imagine today. It is blood, ether, crude instruments, and the constant threat of infection. In rural hospitals, resources are thin. A single mistake can mean a funeral. Page becomes known not only for skill, but for speed. Decisive hands, quick judgments. He is building a reputation that will later translate into politics. The man who acts, who doesn't wait for permission. But medicine also teaches him a brutal lesson. Individual effort cannot solve structural neglect. He can operate on one patient at a time, but he cannot operate on the system. He sees the same pattern again and again. Rural communities paying the same taxes as city people, yet receiving fewer services, fewer roads, fewer hospitals, fewer opportunities. The anger that began as a boy's irritation becomes a doctrine. Decentralization. Not as a slogan, but as survival. In 1906, he marries Ethel Blunt, a nurse. It is not just a domestic detail, it is a partnership forged in the same world of wards and emergencies. They understand what it means to work when the stakes are flesh and breath. Their life together is anchored in service. But Page's mind keeps reaching beyond the operating table. He starts to think like an engineer of society. If you can organize a hospital, why not organize a region? If you can coordinate staff, supplies, and schedules, why not coordinate rail, power, and finance? Then comes a moment that feels like a spark hitting dry grass. Page becomes obsessed with hydroelectric power. To most Australians of the time, electricity is a city luxury, a novelty. To Page, it is liberation. He looks at rivers, his river, and sees not scenery, but potential. Power could mean industry in the regions, jobs that don't require migration to the capitals, light in homes, refrigeration for food. Toss in modern equipment for hospitals. Electricity is not just technology, it is a weapon against distance. He begins campaigning locally, pushing for better infrastructure, better hospitals, better roads. He joins civic bodies, speaks at meetings, writes, persuades, and he learns another lesson. Facts alone don't move governments. Pressure does, organization does, votes do. The system is not designed to hear a rural doctor politely requesting fairness. It is designed to respond when rural people become a bloc that can punish neglect. The First World War arrives like a dark tide. Australia bleeds men into Europe's trenches, and the home front tightens. Page, as a doctor, is immersed in the consequences. Injuries, grief, shortages, the strain on communities already stretched thin. War also accelerates the centralization of power. Governments grow, bureaucracies thicken, decisions concentrate. For Page, this is both a warning and an opportunity. If the state can mobilize for war, it can mobilize for development. If someone forces it to, by the end of the 1910s, the political landscape is shifting. The old parties are strained. Farmers and regional producers feel squeezed by city-based banks, by freight costs, by policies that seem written for urban voters. Out of this pressure, a new force begins to form, a movement that will become the Country Party, built to represent rural interests, with a discipline the Bush has rarely managed before. Page is drawn to it not as a hobby, but as the next logical step in his fight with the system. He is not a natural politician in the theatrical sense. He doesn't have the lazy charm of a born crowd pleaser. What he has is urgency. He speaks like a man who has seen people die because a road was bad, because a hospital was underfunded, because a decision was made too far away by someone who would never smell the river mud of Grafton. His speeches carry the sharpness of diagnosis. Here is the disease, here is the treatment, and if you delay the patient, Australia's regions will deteriorate. In 1919, he makes the leap. He runs for the federal seat of Cowper, a vast electorate on the New South Wales north coast. It is a contest shaped by the post-war mood, by economic anxiety, by the sense that the old political order is not listening. Page wins. A surgeon has entered Parliament, and he arrives with a plan that is bigger than his own career. He wants new states carved out of the overgrown colonies, especially a New England state in northern New South Wales, so that regional people can govern themselves instead of begging Sydney. He wants national development driven by power projects and transport links. He wants a financial system that serves producers, not just city lenders. He wants, in plain terms, to tilt the nation's spine away from the coast. Inside the House of Representatives, he is immediately confronted by the reality he has been circling for years. The system is built to resist him. The major parties treat the new rural members as inconvenient. The bureaucracy moves slowly. The city press often frames regional demands as parochial whining. And yet Page is not alone. The Country Party is growing, and its leverage is simple. In a divided parliament, a small group can become the hinge on which governments swing. Page's personal conflict sharpens into something concrete. He is fighting centralized power, political, financial, and cultural, with the only tools available to him: votes, alliances, and relentless argument. He is also fighting time in a more intimate way. He has left a profession where he could save a life with his own hands for a chamber where saving lives requires persuading strangers. Every year of delay means more preventable deaths in the bush, more young people leaving, more towns shrinking. He carries that pressure like a weight under his ribs. He throws himself into the mechanics of politics the way he once threw himself into surgery. Learning procedure, exploiting openings, pushing for committees, building networks. He becomes a key figure in shaping the Country Party's identity. Not merely protest, but power. Not merely complaint, but policy. He argues that rural Australia must not be a sentimental backdrop for city politicians. It must be a partner with teeth. And as the 1920s begin, the stakes rise fast. Governments are unstable. The Nationalist Party, led by Prime Minister Billy Hughes, is under strain. The Country Party holds the balance in crucial moments. Page can feel the hinge forming beneath his hands. He is no longer just a doctor from Grafton with big ideas. He is becoming something more dangerous to the old order. A man who can decide who governs. The river boy who once watched the Clarence flow past the timber yards is now watching another current. Numbers on the floor of Parliament. Shifting loyalties, the fragile arithmetic of power. He knows that if he times it right, he can force the nation to bargain with the regions. But if he miscalculates, he will be dismissed as a noisy provincial, and the moment will pass. The clock is ticking, and the next move will not be made with a scalpel. It will be made with a coalition. The arithmetic of Parliament is a colder river than the Clarence. It doesn't care about good intentions. It only cares about numbers. Who can stand? Who must fall? Who can be made to beg? And Earle Page, the surgeon who learned to cut fast because delay meant death, now sees a different kind of patient on the table. A government bleeding support, a nation wobbling between city power and rural anger. He has a window, narrow, dangerous, and closing. If he misses it, the country party becomes a footnote. If he hits it, he can force the Commonwealth to look inland. In Canberra in the early 1920s, Page moves with the intensity of a man who hears a clock no one else can hear. He is not there to be liked. He is there to bargain. The Nationalist Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, is a veteran of political knife fights. But even Hughes can't change the basic fact. Without rural votes, he can't guarantee survival. The Country Party is young, still deciding whether it is a protest movement or a governing instrument. Page pushes it toward the second option with almost frightening certainty. He argues that the bush has been polite for too long, and politeness has bought it bad roads, thin hospitals, and decisions made by men who have never driven a night track to reach a patient. Then the moment arrives. The 1922 federal election produces a parliament where no one can rule alone. The Country Party holds the balance. This is the hinge Page has been waiting for, and he grabs it with both hands. But the first twist is brutal. The Country Party will not support Hughes, not after years of being treated as an accessory, not after watching rural interests traded away. Page becomes one of the key voices insisting on a hard line. No deal with Hughes. It is a gamble, because Hughes is not just a prime minister. He is a force of nature, a man who can turn newspapers and factions into weapons. But Page understands something about power. If you flinch at the first threat, you will spend the rest of your life flinching. The negotiations that follow are not gentlemanly. They are a test of nerve. The Country Party demands real influence, not token seats. They demand policy commitments. They demand, in effect, that the Commonwealth stop treating regional Australia as a resource pit and start treating it as a place where people live and die. And Page, with his decentralist obsession, keeps steering the conversation back to structure, development, finance, electricity, transport, systems that can change the map. The result is one of the most consequential bargains in Australian political history. Stanley Bruce becomes Prime Minister. The Country Party enters coalition. And Earle Page, still in his early 40s, still carrying the impatience of a doctor who has seen preventable tragedy, becomes Treasurer of Australia in 1923. It is an astonishing leap, from operating theatre to the nation's money desk. The man who once counted heartbeats now counts budgets, and he does it with the same ruthless focus. Money is not just money. It is the bloodstream of policy. Control the flow, and you can grow new organs, new industries, new towns, new chances. As treasurer, Page is not content to keep the books tidy. He wants to rewire the economy so the regions can breathe. He pushes for national development as a central mission, not a side project. He is deeply involved in the creation of the Loan Council in 1927, a mechanism to coordinate government borrowing, an attempt to impose order on the chaotic competition between states and the Commonwealth for funds. To Page, this is not bureaucratic trivia. It is a lever. If borrowing is coordinated, then big projects, roads, ports, power, can be planned like surgery, not like improvisation. But the deeper Page goes into government, the sharper his real enemy becomes. It isn't just the labor opposition. It isn't even the nationalist old guard. It is centralization itself, the gravitational pull of the capitals, the instinct of institutions to cluster power where it already sits. Every proposal that shifts resources inland meets resistance, sometimes open, sometimes disguised as prudence. Page learns to read the language of delay. Committees, reviews, further consideration. He hates it. He treats it like infection, something that spreads if you don't cut it out early. And yet, the coalition years are also years of genuine achievement. Page is instrumental in pushing forward the idea that the Commonwealth should play a stronger role in national development. He champions infrastructure and sees electrification as destiny. He is a driving force behind the push that leads to the establishment of the Federal Aid Road Scheme in the 1920s. Commonwealth money. For roads, a direct strike at the tyranny of distance. Roads are not romantic, but Page understands their violence. A bad road can kill as surely as a disease because it delays doctors. isolates towns and turns markets into mirages. He also becomes a central figure in the politics of the North. Still dreaming of new states, still arguing that the map drawn in colonial times is strangling the future. The New England movement is never just a hobby for him. It is a worldview. If Sydney controls the North, he believes, the North will always be an afterthought. He pushes the idea relentlessly, even when colleagues roll their eyes, even when the press mocks it as provincial. Page doesn't mind mockery, he minds neglect. But power has a price, and the coalition itself is a constant negotiation. Page and Bruce are allies, but not identical. Bruce is patrician, imperial-minded, comfortable in the language of establishment. Page is a regional insurgent who has learned to operate inside the machine without becoming it. Their partnership works because each needs the other. Bruce needs rural stability. Page needs access to the levers of government. Still, the tension is always there. Two visions of Australia sharing one steering wheel. Then the world begins to tilt. By the late 1920s, the economic weather changes. The Great Depression does not arrive like a single storm cloud. It creeps in like a pressure drop, then hits like a wall. Prices fall, credit tightens, unemployment rises. For rural Australia, it is not an abstract crisis. It is the collapse of markets, the shrinking of cash, the feeling of being trapped. In a country that suddenly cannot pay for itself, Page, as treasurer, is now holding the nation's financial pulse at the moment it starts to weaken. This is where the time limit becomes real. In prosperity, you can argue. In crisis, you either act or you drown. Page is forced into decisions that will define him and haunt him. The orthodox response of the era is austerity. Cut spending, balance budgets, restore confidence. Page is not blind to suffering, but he is also terrified of financial collapse. He believes that if the Commonwealth loses credit, everything else, development, decentralization, even basic services, will become impossible. So he supports measures aimed at fiscal restraint, even as the human cost grows visible in breadlines and boarded-up shops. The political atmosphere turns poisonous. Governments everywhere are blamed for forces they cannot fully control. In Australia, the labor movement fractures under the weight of the Depression, and the entire party system begins to rearrange itself. Page watches the old alignments crack and sees both danger and opportunity, but he is also trapped by responsibility. As treasurer, he cannot simply shout from the sidelines. Every decision is a target. In 1929, the Bruce Page government falls after a dramatic parliamentary defeat tied to industrial relations legislation. The loss is not just electoral, it is psychological. The coalition that seemed like a machine suddenly looks fragile. Labor under James Scullin takes office just as the Depression deepens. Page moves into opposition, but he does not become quiet. He attacks what he sees as drift and indecision, and he pushes for policies that, in his mind, will stabilize the economy and protect national credit. The next twist is that the crisis does not merely punish governments, it mutates them. The Scullin government is torn apart by internal conflict over how to respond to the Depression. The split produces new political formations and new alliances. In 1931, the United Australia Party emerges under Joseph Lyons, a former Labour man who breaks with his party. The Country Party, led by Page, becomes a crucial partner again. The old coalition is reborn in a new shape, and Page returns to government. Still the same man with the same obsession: use power to force development, use finance to force fairness. In 1932, with Lyons as Prime Minister, Page becomes Minister for Commerce. It is a shift from the Treasury's grand machinery to the gritty world of trade, markets, and primary production. Exactly where rural pain is most acute. He fights for producers, for export stability, for policies that keep farms alive when prices are brutal. He is also, increasingly, a senior figure in the government's inner life, experienced, stubborn, and convinced that Australia's future depends on building the regions into something more than suppliers of raw material. But the clock keeps ticking in another way. The 1930s are not only about economics, they are about the gathering shadow of war. International tensions rise. Rearmament begins to creep into budgets and planning. Page, who has always thought in terms of national systems, sees defense and development as linked. A decentralized, electrified, connected Australia is not just prosperous, it is resilient. He pushes for infrastructure with a strategic edge, even if he frames it in the language of growth. And then comes the most personal, most bitter confrontation of his political life, one that is real, documented, and explosive. In 1939, Joseph Lyons dies suddenly in office. The government is leaderless. The United Australia Party must choose a new prime minister. By convention, the Country Party leader, Page, becomes caretaker prime minister while the larger party sorts itself out. The river boy who once dreamed of rewiring the nation now holds the highest office in the land. But here is the cruel contrast. He holds it with a fuse already burning. He is prime minister not because he has conquered the system, but because the system has a gap, and he is the man standing closest to it. 19 days, that is all history will give him. And inside those 19 days, he makes a decision that detonates his own position. The likely successor to Lyons is Robert Menzies. Brilliant, ambitious, and, to Page, unforgivable. Page cannot separate Menzies from the bitter memory of 1938, when Menzies resigned from cabinet after clashing with Lyons, a move Page interprets as disloyalty in a time of national strain. Page sees Menzies as a man who puts personal advancement above collective duty, and with war clouds thickening, Page believes disloyalty is not a character flaw. It is a national risk. So Page does something almost unheard of. As caretaker prime minister and coalition partner, he publicly attacks Menzies on the floor of Parliament, not with polite hints, with open condemnation. He questions Menzies' reliability, his judgment, his loyalty. It is a speech that lands like a thrown chair in a quiet room. The shock is immediate. The United Australia Party is furious. The press is electrified. The coalition relationship, built over years of bargaining and shared power, suddenly looks like it might shatter in the worst possible moment, with Europe on the edge of war. Page's time limit is now a trap. He has days, not months, to shape the outcome. If he blocks Menzies, who replaces him? If he forces a split, does the government collapse? If the coalition breaks, does Australia stumble into a global conflict divided and unstable? Page is trying to perform surgery in a burning building. The United Australia Party chooses Menzies anyway. Page refuses to serve under him. The Country Party, under pressure and fearing national instability, turns on its own leader. In September 1939, Page resigns as leader of the Country Party. The man who once held the balance of power now loses his grip on it, not because he lacked influence, but because he used it in a way that frightened even his allies. And just like that, the 19-day prime minister becomes a political paradox. A man who reached the summit and in the same motion stepped off the edge. He remains in Parliament, still driven, still convinced he was right about Menzies, still obsessed with decentralization and development. But the coalition he helped forge has changed shape without him at the center. The system he fought is still there. Capital still heavy, institutions still slow. And now he has to decide whether he can keep fighting. From a diminished position, because the next phase of his life will test a different kind of endurance. Not the thrill of bargaining for power, not the adrenaline of crisis leadership, but the long grind of influence without command, while the world goes to war, and Australia's future is rewritten under the pressure of events far larger than any one man's plans. War doesn't ask whether you're ready. It just arrives, like a siren in the night. And suddenly the country you thought you were building is a country you must defend. For Earle Page, the man who wanted to remake Australia by wires, roads, and new states, the Second World War is a brutal interruption and a strange opportunity at the same time. He has lost the leadership. He has burned bridges with Robert Menzies. And yet the clock that matters most is no longer political. It's strategic. If Australia is going to survive what's coming, Page believes the nation must do the very thing the capitals have always resisted. Spread out, build up the regions, and turn distance from a weakness into a shield. He returns to the backbench with a reputation that is half legend, half warning label. Colleagues remember the 19 days, the parliamentary attack, the resignation. Some treat him like a man who can't be trusted with matches. But Page is not built for silence. He is built for campaigns. And now his campaign has a new language. Wartime production, national security, supply lines, airfields, power generation. He argues that decentralization is not a romantic rural dream. It is defense policy. Put everything in Sydney and Melbourne, and you create targets. Starve the inland of industry, and you create bottlenecks. Leave the north underdeveloped, and you invite danger. The twist is that war makes planners listen to ideas they used to laugh at. Suddenly, the Commonwealth is thinking in terms of national systems. Exactly Page's obsession. Transport corridors matter. Fuel storage matters. Electricity matters. The ability to move food, troops, and equipment across long distances matters. Page pushes, prods, and nags from the benches, writing, speaking, lobbying, pressing ministers with the persistence of a doctor who won't leave the bedside. He wants hydroelectric power, national grids, modern ports, better roads, and a stronger Commonwealth hand in development. He is not asking for comfort. He is asking for capacity, but he is also fighting a more intimate enemy: irrelevance. In politics, losing the leadership can be like losing oxygen. The room still contains air, but it's thinner, and you have to work twice as hard to breathe. Page refuses to accept that his peak has passed. He keeps his seat of Cowper, keeps his voice, keeps his files and schemes. He watches Menzies fall in 1941, watches the government wobble, watches the Country Party and the United Australia Party struggle to hold coherence. Then John Curtin's Labour government takes power, and the war comes closer, closer than most Australians had ever imagined it could. When Japan enters the war and the Pacific ignites, Page's arguments stop sounding theoretical. Northern Australia becomes a frontline zone. The fear is no longer abstract. Air raids hit Darwin. The map feels suddenly smaller, and the coastline feels suddenly exposed. Page's decentralist instincts sharpen into something like urgency bordering on fury. Why did we wait so long to build the North? Why did we let the inland stay thin and fragile? Why did we keep pretending that a few coastal cities could carry an entire continent through a crisis? He is not in cabinet, but he is not powerless. He is a veteran with a network, and he knows how to turn a national emergency into a policy lever. He pushes for development authorities, for coordinated planning, for the kind of long-term infrastructure that war demands and peace benefits from. He keeps returning to electricity as if it were a moral issue. In Page's mind, power lines are not just engineering, they are lifelines. A town with reliable electricity can run a hospital, a factory, a cold store, a radio station. A region with power can hold people. Without it, the inland bleeds population and opportunity. Then as the war turns and the end begins to appear on the horizon, Page starts aiming at the next battlefield: the peace. He has seen what happens after crises, how the old habits rush back in, how centralization reasserts itself, how the capitals absorb the spoils. He wants to lock in wartime lessons before they evaporate. He wants post-war reconstruction to be more than housing and demobilization. He wants it to be a redesign of the nation's skeleton. And here comes another turn. The man who once held the treasury, who once briefly held the prime ministership, now finds his most enduring influence not in the top job but in the architecture of institutions. Page becomes one of the loudest advocates for national planning bodies in coordinated development. He pushes for a Commonwealth that can think beyond annual budgets and election cycles. He wants a permanent mechanism to drive projects across state borders, because rivers, power, and transport do not care about colonial lines on a map. In 1949, the political tide shifts again. Menzies returns to power, leading the Liberal Country Coalition. For Page, it is a bitter irony. The man he once tried to block is now dominant, and the coalition is back. But politics is not therapy. Page does not get closure. He gets choices. He could sulk into the margins, or he could climb back into the machine and try to steer it from inside. He chooses the machine. Despite the old hostility, Page is brought into the ministry in the new government. In 1950, he becomes Minister for Health. It is, in a strange way, a return to his origin story. The doctor-politician, the surgeon who never stopped thinking about systems that keep people alive. But now the patient is national health policy. Hospitals, funding, pharmaceuticals, the growing expectations of a post-war society that has tasted collective effort and doesn't want to go back to patchwork. Health is not a quiet portfolio. It is where budgets meet bodies. Every decision has a human face. Page approaches it with the same impatience he once brought to rural roads. Delays cost lives. He pushes for expansion and coordination, for better access, for national standards. He is operating in a period when Australia is building the foundations of modern social policy, and he wants health to be treated as infrastructure, something you invest in, not something you merely manage. But Page's deeper obsession never leaves him. Even as health minister, he keeps talking about development, decentralization, and power. He keeps pushing the idea that the Commonwealth should drive big projects that change the geography of opportunity. He is especially drawn to hydroelectricity, water turned into national strength. The Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme becomes the great symbol of post-war nation building, and while Page is not its sole author, And it is the kind of project that feels like it was pulled from his private notebook. Massive, coordinated, transformative, tying together power generation, irrigation, and regional growth. It is the Commonwealth acting like an engineer of destiny, not a clerk of routine. Yet even in these years, Page is fighting time in a more personal way. He is aging, but he refuses to behave like an elder statesman who offers gentle reflections. He remains combative, restless, and sometimes out of step with the newer political style. The Country Party has evolved. The coalition has its own rhythms. Page is respected, but he is also seen as a man from an earlier era, an era of grand schemes and blunt speeches. He keeps pushing for new states, still convinced that the old boundaries are a straitjacket. He keeps arguing that regional Australia must not be treated as a museum of tradition, but as a platform for modern industry. The tension with Menzies never fully disappears, but it changes shape. It becomes less a personal duel and more a contest between temperaments. Page, the relentless decentralist, Menzies, the master of metropolitan, stability and national rhetoric. Page wants the map physically altered. New administrative units, new power networks, new inland cities. Menzies wants cohesion, continuity, and a nation that can be governed without tearing up its foundations. They can cooperate, but they do not dream the same dream. As health minister, Page's work is practical and grinding, and it forces him to confront something he cannot out-argue: the complexity of modern government. Health policy is a maze of jurisdictions, professions, funding models, and public expectations. It is exactly the kind of committee language he used to despise, except now he must use it to get anything done. He pushes reforms, negotiates with states, deals with medical bodies, and tries to expand access while keeping the system financially sustainable. The surgeon who once cut through flesh now has to cut through paperwork, and sometimes the paperwork wins. Still, he keeps moving. He stays in the ministry until 1956. By then, he has served in federal parliament for more than 3 decades. He has been treasurer, caretaker prime minister, senior minister, party leader, coalition architect. He has watched Australia pass through depression, war, and reconstruction. And he has never stopped trying to pull the nation inland, away from the gravitational pull of the capitals. When he leaves the ministry, it is not a dramatic fall. It is the slow, inevitable shift of a long career toward its final phase. But Page does not retire from ideas. He continues to speak, to write, to advocate. He remains a symbol of a particular kind of Australian ambition, the belief that a continent should not be governed like a narrow strip of coastline, that modernity should not belong only to the cities, that the bush deserves not charity but infrastructure. And beneath all of it, the old time limit keeps changing its face. In the 1920s, it was the window to force a coalition bargain. In 1939, it was 19 days at the summit. In wartime, it was survival. Now in the 1950s, it is mortality. The quiet knowledge that the body eventually refuses to keep pace with the mind. Page can feel the years, but he keeps acting as if he can outrun them. As if one more scheme, one more push, one more argument might finally make the system bend. Because for Earle Page, politics was never just about winning office. It was about building a different Australia, one where a child in a river town could grow up with the same access to power, health, and opportunity as a child in the shadow of a city skyline. And even as his formal power fades, the question he leaves hanging in the air grows sharper. Did Australia build the nation he tried to design, or did it merely borrow his ideas when it needed them, then return as always to the comfort of the coast? You can measure a politician's life in speeches, in votes, in titles. But with Earle Page, the real measurement is harsher and more cinematic. How many of his ideas survived him, and how many died the moment he stopped pushing them with his own hands? Because Page is the kind of man who doesn't simply leave office. He leaves a vacuum. And the moment he steps back, the old gravity returns. The pull of the capitals, the comfort of the familiar, the slow drift back to the coastline. By 1956, when he is out of the ministry, Page is 75. Most men at that age are allowed to become ceremonial. Page refuses. He keeps turning up, keeps writing, keeps lobbying, keeps insisting that Australia is still unfinished. He is no longer the man with the lever in cabinet, but he is still the man with the blueprint. And he is still fighting the same enemy he fought as a young doctor, staring at preventable deaths in a country hospital. Distance. Not romantic distance, real distance. The kind that turns a minor illness into a funeral. The kind that turns a bright kid into a lost opportunity because the nearest chance is hundreds of miles away. The twist is that, in the late 1950s, Australia is changing faster than ever, just not in the direction Page wanted. The post-war boom is swelling the big cities. Cars are multiplying, suburbs are spreading like ink and water. Television arrives, and suddenly the nation's imagination is being broadcast from metropolitan studios. The country Page tried to decentralize is becoming more centralized in culture, in population, in power. And Page can see it happening in real time. Like watching a patient ignore the prescription, he keeps campaigning for new states, still convinced that the old colonial boundaries are a trap, that regional Australia will never get fair treatment while decisions are made in distant capitals. He argues that local control isn't a sentimental idea, it's administrative oxygen. He wants northern New South Wales, where he built his base, to have its own political center of gravity. He wants the map redrawn so that development isn't something regions beg for, but something they can drive. But the system has learned how to resist him without openly fighting him. It doesn't have to defeat Page in debate. It can simply wait him out. And now the time limit becomes brutally literal. Page's health begins to fail. The man who spent his life treating bodies and building systems is forced to confront the one system he cannot redesign, his own. Age is not a scandal, not a headline, not a parliamentary ambush. It is a slow tightening, a narrowing of energy, a shortening of days. And for a man like Page, who lived as if urgency were a moral duty, this is the most humiliating opponent of all. Still, he keeps his seat. Cooper has been his political home since 1919, and he clings to it not out of vanity, but out of belief, as long as he is in Parliament. The regions have a voice that refuses to soften. He is one of the last living links to the era when the Commonwealth was still inventing itself, when the rules were not yet hardened into tradition. He has outlasted rivals, outlasted governments, outlasted the political fashions that once made him seem dangerous. And then in 1961, the deadline arrives. Page is 81. He has been in the House of Representatives for more than 40 years, an almost unimaginable stretch of time. The Parliament he entered was still young. The Parliament he is leaving is a machine of committees, departments, and modern bureaucracy. He resigns his seat in September 1961. It is not a triumphant farewell. It is not a grand final speech that ties everything up neatly. It is the quiet ending of a long, stubborn campaign. But the story doesn't let him fade out gently. Because the moment he resigns, the seat of Cowper goes to a by-election. And the result is a shock. The Country Party loses it. After 4 decades of Page holding that electorate, the grip breaks. It's as if the electorate itself had been held together by his personal force of will. And once he steps away, the old loyalties rearrange. For Page, this is not just a political disappointment. It is a warning flare. It suggests that what he built was not merely a party base, but a personal bridge between regional voters and national power. And bridges collapse when the engineer is gone. 3 months later, on 20th December 1961, Earle Page dies. The image is stark. A man who spent his life trying to stretch Australia outward, into the valleys, the rivers, the inland, reaches the end just as the country is accelerating into a new era. The 1960s are about to roar. The cities will grow taller. The economy will modernize. The nation will become more confident, more urban, more connected. And Page will not be there to argue, to nag, to demand that the connection run both ways. So what is left when the voice is gone? This is where Page becomes complicated, because his legacy is not a single law with his name stamped on it. It's a pattern, a way of thinking that keeps resurfacing whenever Australia hits the same old problem. How do you govern a continent without letting it become a thin strip of prosperity along the sea? Look at the big post-war nation-building projects, and you can see his fingerprints in the philosophy, even when his name isn't on the plaque. The idea that the Commonwealth should coordinate development across state borders, the belief that electricity is destiny, that power generation and transmission can change where people live, where industry grows, where opportunity settles, the insistence that infrastructure is not just convenience, but national strength. These are Page ideas, even when they are carried by other hands. And then there is health, his other lifelong obsession, the one that began with a doctor's bag and ended in ministerial briefs. Page helped push Australia toward the notion that health is a national responsibility, not a patchwork of charity and local improvisation. He lived in the tension between state and Commonwealth powers, and he kept pressing for coordination because he had seen what disconnection costs. In a country as spread out as Australia, a fragmented health system isn't merely inefficient, it is cruel. Yet the most dramatic part of his legacy is also the most frustrating, the dream he never fully achieved. Page wanted decentralization not as a slogan, but as a redesign. He wanted new states. He wanted inland cities with real industrial weight. He wanted regional Australia to be a place where modern life could thrive without apology. He wanted the nation's population and production to spread, so that Australia would be safer, fairer, and harder to break in a crisis. Australia did some of it, enough to prove he wasn't crazy, but it never did it at the scale he imagined. The capitals kept growing, the coastal gravity kept winning, and the argument Page made, over and over for decades, kept returning like a recurring fever. Every time there is a drought, a flood, and a supply chain shock, a housing crisis, a hospital under strain, a debate about energy grids, a question about whether the regions are being left behind, the ghost of Page's logic walks back into the room. And there's another twist, quieter but sharper. Page's most famous moment, the 19 days as caretaker prime minister, is not what defines him in the long run. It's the least important part of the Page story, and yet it's the part people remember because it's easy to summarize. A title, a number, a curiosity. The real Page story is harder to package. It's a man who treated politics like engineering and medicine at the same time. Diagnose the weakness, design the system, build the fix. It's a man who believed that if you could wire electricity into a valley, you could wire opportunity into a life. It's a man who fought not just opponents, but inertia, because inertia is the most powerful force in government, and it doesn't need to hate you to defeat you. It only needs to outlast you, and that is the final conflict, the one he never truly won, time versus will. Page had will in industrial quantities. He could push and push and push, long after others would have stopped. But time is patient. Time doesn't argue back, it just keeps moving. It waits for the voice to tire, for the hands to slow, for the seat to be vacated, for the by-election to swing, for the country to drift back toward its habits. Yet even then, Page doesn't vanish, because the questions he raised are still unanswered in any final way. How do you make a continent feel like one country? How do you stop distance from becoming destiny? How do you build a nation where a child in a river town has the same shot as a child in a capital suburb? Earle Page spent his life insisting that those questions were not poetic. They were practical. They could be solved with planning, power, roads, hospitals, and political courage. He didn't always persuade the people around him. He often irritated them. Sometimes he alienated them. He could be blunt, impatient, and so convinced of his own blueprint that he underestimated how much politics runs on emotion and loyalty. But he was rarely small. And when you strip away the titles, the feuds, the coalition deals, the parliamentary storms, what remains is a single, relentless image. A man standing on the edge of a vast continent, pointing inland, insisting that the future is not only where the crowd already is. He died in 1961, but his argument never really did.